So far on the Any Button to Start World Tour, we have looked at London and Tokyo, and we have examined how different developers have adapted two very different cities. For this next entry, I wanted to pick a town that would spiritually fall in the middle of our two other polar opposite cities. In the end, I decided to go with New York City, the Big Apple, New Amsterdam, New York, New York, the city that never sleeps, the big melting. Whilst he's doing that, how about me and you take a look at New York City in video game? Before we get on with the video, please like and subscribe. It really helps. And if you want to stay up to date with everything going on at the Any Button to Start channel, make sure to hit that bell icon to get notifications as well. Thank you, and now back on with the video. We're kicking off today's journey with a short swing around the most architecturally realised recreation of New York City we currently have in the world of video games. Sony's Insomniac's Marvel's Spider-Man and Spider-Man Miles Morales contain a visceral and lively version of New York City that can be explored on foot or by web, allowing the city a level of explorable verticality rarely seen in any open world games. Of course, it helps that the swinging mechanics are the most fleshed out and satisfying in any game bearing the Spidey name, meaning traversal through the Big Apple is not only simple and intuitive, but also engaging and mesmerizing. Swinging past some of the most famous landmarks and being able to climb some of the tallest buildings in the world allows the player a sense of dominion over the city, as if being able to traverse the concrete jungle with such ease makes one the king of it. If only that city didn't feel so sanitized. Now, of course, I know this is a Marvel property, so grit wasn't exactly expected. Though 2018's Marvel's Spider-Man's New York City feels a little too clean for my liking. New York hasn't exactly been too dangerous since the turn of the millennium, but even next to Spider-Man's gangs and car chases, modern day New York still has an edge to it that these Spider-Man titles just don't capture. They do, however, manage to capture a small glimpse of the camaraderie felt between New Yorkers. Especially in Spider-Man Miles Morales, we get to see how Spider-Man and his everyday secret identity interact with the city and the people that call it home. When it comes to virtual tourism and seeing the sights of this historical city from regularly unobtainable angles, Marvel's Spider-Man and Spider-Man Miles Morales cannot be beat. Though, like most of the rest of those games, their depiction of Spider-Man's hometown feels a little heartless. I thought in response to Spider-Man's lack of grit, we would now take a look at a series of games that is basically all grit. Max Payne is a rogue cop on the run in New York City. His wife and newborn baby were killed by the mob, and now all he lives for is revenge. And you're controlling him. Max Payne and its sequel, Max Payne 2: The Fall of Max Payne, are two of the most hauntingly atmospheric, mechanically satisfying, and artistically focused games of all time. Remedy's love letter to modern day noir fiction sees New York through the eyes of its underbelly. There is no Times Square here. In fact, I believe Max Payne revels in the idea of New York presented in films like Taxi Driver and King of New York. A pre-Giuliani Big Apple, a dirty, crime-ridden place where only those at the extremes of society live, the ultra-rich and the dirt poor. Max Payne clearly understands that duality of late 20th century New York, as Max is taken through some of the most run-down crack dens the city has to offer, right after luxury high-rise apartments, the types owned by the Patrick Batemans of the world. It's rare that Max Payne or its sequel have the player exploring the city's streets, though the variety and level of detail presented in the interiors manage to paint a shockingly vivid picture of the city as a whole. Now for another game set around the same period as Max Payne, and also starring a member of the NYPD. Parasite Eve. This cult classic PS1 survival horror RPG was made by Squaresoft, creators of Final Fantasy, and released in 1998. You play as Brea, who just so happens to be at the epicenter of a paranormal parasitic outbreak in New York City, and seems to be the key to solving it. Parasite Eve sees New York evacuated due to the outbreak, and so us players get a rare look at a deserted Big Apple, with cars abandoned and shops looted, all presented in Square's signature pre-rendered style. As I went quite thoroughly over in my Racing Lagoon video, Squaresoft in the 90s were quite fond of a technique known as pre-rendering, in which certain assets in the scene, usually backgrounds, are actually flat 2D images, whilst only the characters are 3D models, saving on computing power. Parasite Eve uses this technique wonderfully, with its backgrounds looking detailed and, most importantly, identifiably New York. I believe Parasite Eve uses the scale of the city incredibly well. The fact that most of the areas of the town you visit are empty and derelict, matched with the foreboding scale of the architecture depicted in the backgrounds, gives the game an extremely eerie and isolating tone, which achieves a horror separate from the cramped and claustrophobic scares of its contemporaries like Resident Evil and Silent Hill. Parasite Eve's smooth, cool and jazzy soundtrack helps with selling its particular flavour of NYC as well. When viewing some of the concept art or seeing Aya in her sleek black dress matched with some of the fantastic music tracks by Yoko Shimomura, one gets a visceral sense of the elegant and enticing depiction of New York Parasite Eve is going for. Speaking of music, let us move on to perhaps the oddest entry in today's list. Def Jam Vendetta and Def Jam Fight for New York. These two 3D arcade fighters released in the mid-2000s are homages to New York's very own homegrown music genre, hip-hop. I wanted to include these two titles not because they necessarily accurately portray NYC in architecture or spirit, but because I believe hip-hop and rap are inextricably linked to the city and its culture. The Def Jam series of games centers around a mashup no one knew they needed: hip-hop and pro wrestling. Yes, these two games see the player take on or take up the role of some of the biggest names in hip-hop, battling it out in the squared circle. As rap legends Ghostface Killer, Method Man, Redman, Exhibit, Ludacris, Joe Budden and Henry Rollins, okay, maybe not those last two, you will fight with the same high-flying moves you would normally see in a WWE title. Now, these games haven't aged incredibly well and are definitely a little bit janky, though as a representation of New York and the bombastic hip-hop scene it birthed, I couldn't think of a better game. Okay, so now I'm gonna give you what you came for. This is Liberty City. Normally in this series, I try to stray away from any fictionalized versions of the cities I cover, though for this entry, I just had to make an exception. The Grand Theft Auto series is known for its satirical takes on major American cities, but Liberty City might be their most famous. Of course, this fictional city inside a satirized America is based on New York City, and despite the name change, it is recreated rather accurately. First showing up as one of the three cities in the first game in the series, Liberty City would return for Rockstar's big leap into the third dimension, with GTA 3 in 2001. The third Grand Theft Auto game sent thunderous shockwaves through the gaming industry and even wider pop culture, quickly cementing itself and its developers as forerunners in this new decade of gaming. I believe the city GTA 3 depicts is at least half of the reason for the game's success. Within GTA 3, Liberty City feels alive and brimming with cartoonish satire. It's the perfect, wacky, Americanized playground for your crime and destruction. And it would feel similar when brought back for the spin-off game GTA Liberty City Stories. These two depictions of the city, of course, changed the way cities were used in video games forever, though Liberty City would not fully come into its own and gain the level of authenticity it holds now until 2008, with the release of Grand Theft Auto 4. A while back, in my Sopranos video, I said GTA 4 is the worst GTA, but after playing back through the game and its 2 DLCs for this video, I have decided that no. In fact, GTA 4 is the best GTA, and it's all down to Liberty City. Wow, look at that! Someone on the internet changing their opinion. Incredible. Yes, GTA 4's version of Liberty City is magnitudes deeper than its previous depictions. Despite the city simply being larger, the attention to detail made possible by the generational leap in technology since GTA 3 allowed Rockstar to create a video game facsimile of New York's signature cultural melting pot. GTA 4 and its more grounded take on the series allow this version of Liberty City to feel multifaceted in its sights and atmosphere. Each borough genuinely has its own atmosphere and tone, and the stark divide between the rich and poor of the city is put front and center through the city's layout. It's not just subways and yellow cabs that make Liberty City feel so authentic, but it's the characters who inhabit it and the pieces of environmental storytelling dotted on almost every square foot of the map. GTA and its writers, through their non-American outsider perspective, have managed on multiple occasions to capture the unique and fascinating contradictions and mindset inherent to the Big Apple. And a list like this would not be complete without Liberty City. If I'm breaking my rule once, I might as well break it again. Mafia 2 is set in a fictionalized depiction of New York called Liberty Bay. The reason I wanted to include this game that, in all honesty, is very similar to our previous entry, is that Mafia 2 will stand as our one historical depiction of NYC covered today. Yes, Mafia 2 presents a period of New York history quite often romanticized and mythologized today, the 1940s. Mafia 2 presents the most distilled form of the New York mobster story, so it most definitely needed that 40s setting, and it helps that there was clearly plenty of love and care put in by the developers to accurately evoke such an iconic era for the city. Mafia 2 depicts a New York not yet completely ravaged by industrialism, when families could still afford to pay the rent, and when the police weren't the only ones upholding the law. Of course, Mafia 2's Mafia story must deal with some of the more unsavory sides of its older setting, including racism, sexism, and xenophobia. Though, I would say the game's writers do a good job of treating those subjects with the weight they deserve, and of putting those problematic aspects of the period in their correct context, adding to the game's historical accuracy. On a visceral level, it's just really cool to virtually walk around such a foreign version of such a famous place. And it's when Mafia 2 leans into that historical setting that the game and its version of New York really shine. Our final game today is one that is known for its eerily accurate predictions of the real world near future, but mostly for just being one of the greatest PC games ever released. Warren Spector's 2000 masterpiece, Deus Ex, is one of the strongest examples for the power of video games to deliver a narrative and to immerse an audience within it. Its near-future, cyberpunk-esque dystopian New York is one that captures the Big Apple's imposing grandeur and sense of centralism to world politics. It paints the political and financial elite of the city as shady, all-knowing specters looming down at the struggling masses from their high-rise penthouses. an obvious nod to the real-life extreme wealth situated in the city. In 2000, before the September 11th terrorist attacks that would shake the city and its people to this day, Spector and his writing team had the foresight to predict that New York's famous skyline would not fully survive the turn of the millennium, and that terrorism and the ideological holes that come with it would soon envelop the city in their fiery grasp. The picture of New York that Deus Ex paints is dark and ugly. Hell, the pictures it paints of the entire world ain't really lookers either. But through this pessimism, Deus Ex manages to tell a story of great intrigue and philosophical weight that still relates to our world today, and its use of New York City is a large part of that. There it is, 7 unique depictions of New York in video games. It's funny, as I do this series more and more, I realise just how much the identity of the chosen city will affect the games set in them. New York definitely lends itself to more grounded and realistic experiences, and I wonder how our next city will affect its games. Next time, we take a look at Los Angeles in video games. LA. Oh god, don't start that again. Thanks for watching. Thanks for getting to the end of the video. I really hope you enjoyed it. Let me know what you thought about it in the comments below, like this video, and subscribe to the Any Button to Start channel. We've got some really cool content coming that you're not going to want to miss. Until next time.